Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some holiday shaker cards with dimension. I'm going to be using the new Timeless collection from Simon Hurley and Spellbinders. This is a great collection of different holiday images. I love these two Mantel ones. The first one was Mantel Village, and then this second one was Mantel Decorations, as well as the Whimsical bottle brush trees. These could be used all together or individually, and I'm going to use them individually today. Then there's the vintage layered ornament set, as well as the classic Christmas tree die set. And I can see this one being used for so many classic Christmas cards. There's also two embossing folders, one with pine needles and it has a die that goes with it. I won't be using the die today, but I'll be using the embossing folder for some backgrounds as well as a wood background. To create some extra dimension in several of the cards today, I'm going to be using the new shaker domes from Spellbinders. These come in 5 different shapes. I have 4, but I'm going to be using 3 of them for the cards that I'm using or creating in this video. So I'm going to start with the classic Christmas tree die set. I'm going to create just a classic holiday card. I've got all of my pieces die cut and ready to go. Whenever I'm prepping to create a card, I like to die cut everything and put them in those medium craft stacks. It keeps everything together and it helps me stay very organized. Before I start to assemble anything, I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending just to add some visual dimension. I have the tree pieces here die cut out of Fern Cardstock, and I'm doing some ink blending with some Forest Moss Distress ink. The silhouette part of the tree is die cut out of Forest Cardstock, and that I did the same color with Distress. It's just going to give a little bit of a darker center than the outside, and it's just going to create some visual dimension. For the trunk and the branches, that is cut out of Latte Cardstock, and I like to glue everything together with liquid glue for the most part. It is one of those glues that gives you a little bit of extra wiggle room, and because you don't need a whole lot of glue, it ends up lasting a long time. So I find it's pretty economical to be using liquid glue. The one that I use is Barely Art glue, and I have it in a fine line bottle, so it's perfect for really fine die cuts as well as larger mats and pieces, gluing them on your card. And you can see how quick and easy it is to glue everything together. While I'm gluing things, I always love using a large acrylic block. This is just a stamping block to put on my pieces to hold everything down nice and flat, and it frees up my hands to be working on the next piece. The odd time when you're using liquid glue, sometimes the paper doesn't really like it and starts to curl. This avoids any of that. It doesn't happen often. It just depends sometimes on the cardstock, but I find this is handy, and I love not just sitting waiting for glue to dry. This glue does start to grab fairly quickly though, so you wouldn't have to wait for too long. The base of the tree I have die cut out of some gold pearl cardstock. This is from the Gold Treasured Cardstock pack. I glued the 2 pieces together initially and then realized I probably should put it right on the trunk of the tree. So that trunk goes between those 2 pieces. So I redid that and then put that acrylic block together. So that's a nice thing. Another nice thing about liquid glue. It gives you not only that wiggle time, but if you have just put the pieces together and realize that you forgot something, which I often do. I often am thinking about something else and miss a step or forget a step. This just gives you a little bit more room to do that. For the gifts to go under the tree, I have some printed paper scraps here. These are from the Oh Joyful Day card kit. I have been doing several videos using a bunch of the different printed papers from this pack, and I just collected all of my scraps in a little Ziploc bag and figured this was a great use for some of those scraps. So I have them die cut out of some of the different prints. I have some of the box lids die cut out of some solid cardstock scrap bits, as well as gold scraps. I also use some of the gold scraps from the Gold Treasured Cardstock pack in glitter as well as mirror to die cut the pieces for the ribbons and the ties for on these gifts. So I always like to mix and match a bunch of different finishes, and those Treasured Cardstock packs are perfect for that. They come in 5 different finishes. There is a mirror, a matte, a brushed, glitter, as well as a pearl. So you can mix and match all of them, and because they're all in one package, it's really easy to pick and choose which one works best for you. And that comes in gold, silver, as well as rose gold. So I love the fact that there's those choice of finishes as well. And you get 3 sheets of each of those cardstock packs. I've been using them for several months now, and I haven't been skimping on them. And I still have a bunch of cardstock left. I mostly use it for die cuts, but sometimes I use it for mats as well. So it does go a long way. Once I have all of the pieces for these little gifts glued together, I'll set those aside to dry for a few minutes, especially when you're gluing on top of that mirrored cardstock. Sometimes it takes a little bit for that to dry. For my card base, I just have a white card base here. I'm using the gold matte cardstock from that Treasured Gold pack to do a matte behind my printed paper here. And this printed paper is another one from that Oh Joyful Day card kit. So my matte there was cut to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. The red printed paper was cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. With that background done, I'm ready to start gluing down the tree. So I use that Barely Art glue to glue that down. There's also a tiny little star die that goes in this set as well. So I have that die cut out of some of the gold glitter paper. There's ornament pieces that are all die cut. I have some done out of the crimson cardstock. That's going to coordinate really well with that background color. And then I also have some die cut out of the glitter cardstock, as well as one of the other gold cardstocks. And again, I like to mix and match the finishes to them. The other thing that I'm going to do here is once these are all on here and dried, I'm going to add some glossy accents. So that's going to give all of those ornaments some extra shine, as well as a little bit of visual dimension. It's one of those things that I love doing, and I love the look of it. It just makes those ornaments pop on that cardstock. Now, sometimes when you're die cutting or creating with cardstock, because cardstock has a matte finish, they kind of are a little bit dull. And by adding that glossy accents on there, not only does it make it shiny, give it a different finish, but it makes it pop off that tree because it has a different texture than just the matte cardstock. So what I do when I'm putting these ornaments down is I put one color down first, and I try to scatter them around the trees. There's 2 different shapes of ornaments here, and I'm trying to make sure that they're not I don't have a bunch of the same shape all together. Once I did that with the crimson, I went in with the gold glitter cardstock, and then I went in with the gold, I think it's mirror cardstock that I used for the other ones. So after doing all of those different ones, then I will just see if there's any bare spots, and I might add the odd ornament or 2 until I'm absolutely satisfied. Once those are done, I will let them dry for a few moments, and then I'm going to add the trees to the bottom of the tree because that glue has dried by now. So I'm going to start with some of the bigger ones, gluing them close to the base of the tree, and I'm using that same acrylic block to hold everything down while I'm gluing those. Because these are all a bunch of die cuts glued on top of each other, they have a bit of dimension to them. So when I go to glue some of the gifts on top of those ones, there's not going to be as much surface for them to stick to. So by putting that acrylic block on there, that's going to help hold them down and help that glue to start grabbing on each other. I'll start with the largest gift. There's 3 sizes in this set. Then I'll go with the medium size. And then every once in a while, I'll tuck in one of the small ones if I see a spot for it. I didn't think I was going to use all of the gifts that I had assembled, but I ended up doing all of them. I always like to have extra pieces when I'm doing things like this. And then if I happen to finish my project with some of those extra pieces, I'll just take a little Ziploc bag, put them in there, and I'll just store it with that same die set. Because if I'm ever going to want some more of those ornaments again, most of the time it's going to be when I'm using that die set, or if I know that ornament die set is there and I want to use it for something else, that's going to be where I look for that die set, and I'll see those die cuts already done. So everything is glued down. The glue isn't completely dry, but it doesn't need to be completely dry before adding the glossy accents. We're going to have to wait probably a good hour for this glossy accents to dry anyways. So might as well let the rest of the glue dry while that glossy accents is dry. If you've never used glossy accents before, it's just a medium that makes things clear and glossy, but it does take some time to dry. It comes out of the bottle kind of having a little bit of a milky haze to it, but once it's dry, it's completely clear. And now it's all completely done, and you can see how much those ornaments really pop off that tree because of that extra shine on there. With that card done, we're ready to work on the ornament card. This one's using that vintage layered ornaments die set. I have a piece of Fern Cardstock here that I'm going to use for my background, and I want it to look like those ornaments are hanging off those pine branches. To give the background a little bit more of an interesting look, I'm using some temporary adhesive, taping it to my embossing folder, and then I'm going to add some ink to that embossing folder so that the recessed areas, not the pine branch parts, the background parts are going to be a darker color. It's going to make those pine branches look lighter, and it's just going to make them really pop off that background and give it a lot more texture. So I tend to do this about 3 times. I find that's about the right amount to get the right amount of ink coverage over my background. I'm using that same Forest Moss Distress ink that I used on the first card to do that ink blending. Often with these, because it's dye-based ink and the embossing folder is plastic, that plastic embossing folder wants to resist that ink. So it starts to bubble and you kind of get a little blotchy look from that first inking. The second one is better, but I always find that by the third one, that's when you've got some really good ink coverage. And because we're putting that ink on there 3 times, that background starts to get quite dark. So you do want to choose an ink that's not going to be too dark for the look that you're going for. With that done, I can put my machine away, and that distress ink just rinses right off that embossing folder, so you don't need any special cleaner to clean it. I'm going to add just a little bit of light ink blending around the edges just to give it a little bit more visual dimension and to kind of frame it a little bit. I'm using that same Forest Moss ink, but it's not going to be as dark as my background because I'm just doing some light ink blending. I'm not putting a heavy amount of ink down to create as much as was on that background. I have a crimson cardstock mat here that I'm going to use on the card. This is cut to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and then my embossed piece there is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. So I have very thin mats on these. Sometimes I like to have a little bit more white showing or a little bit more of the matte showing, and sometimes I don't. With these particular cards, I find that the die cuts are a little bit larger, so I wanted to make sure to give enough space for the focal point and those die cuts than having more of the matte showing. So I'm using that same Barely Art glue to glue everything together and using that acrylic block to hold it down in place while I'm gluing the next piece. Now, especially when you're working with embossed paper, you want to make sure that you have a good amount of adhesive on there. I have most of my ornaments die cut already, but what I like about this die set is there is an outline die as well as the inside part, the detailed die. So the outline die is perfect for die cutting a piece to go behind, and I've got it die cut out of different various gold cardstocks from that Gold Treasured cardstock pack. And then I have different colors of ornaments die cut as well. I glue or I tape in the inside piece before I do my die cutting to make sure that that's not going to move on me. I want to make sure that it's nice and centered and it's not going to move. This particular one has an area or a design that is die cut out of the center, but that design has some inner pieces. And if I were to die cut it ahead of time and take it out of the die, I would have had to try to evenly place them. By keeping those pieces inside the die set, when I go and add that glue, I can press those pieces down while I'm taking that die cut out, and then I don't really have to worry about the placement of those pieces. Most of them stayed exactly where they were supposed to be. Then I can let that glue completely dry and glue the rest of mine together. Now, one of the pieces or one of the background pieces that I used is that gold glitter cardstock. Gold glitter cardstock or any color glitter cardstock tends to take a little bit longer to dry, as well as specialty cardstocks, because you're gluing it onto a non-porous surface. So I do wait for that to dry a little bit longer than I do when I'm gluing 2 pieces of cardstock together, just because most of the time those finishes are coated, so they don't absorb the glue as well. So the glue is really only drying from one side. So be patient with that. Let it dry a little bit longer. It does absolutely dry. You just have to be a bit more patient and wait. While I'm waiting for those to dry, I'm going to glue the 2 pieces of each one of the ornament tops together. This die set has 3 different designs for the ornament tops, so I have a different design for ornament tops for each one of those ornaments. And there's 2 pieces to them. There's the base, and then there's an upper part that has a little bit more decoration, making it a little bit more fancy, and it has a really pretty look to it. I have these die cut out of the gold pearl cardstock from that same Treasure Gold cardstock pack. Most of these pieces are die cut out of scraps from future projects, so it's a great way to use up a bunch of those scraps because especially the ornament tops are pretty small. So you can get a lot of use out of those scraps. So never throw the scraps away. They're great for using to create or to die cut small pieces for little accents. I also used those same scraps for die cutting the ornaments from the previous card. To add just a little bit of extra sparkle, I have some gold essential gems. This pack here has two different finishes to it. So the top part of the pack has more transparent gold and it just sparkles a little bit more. The bottom part of the pack, they're a little bit more opaque. They still shine and they still sparkle, but I just found that the top part just sparkled just a little bit more. So I'm using those ones and they come in 4 different sizes on the pack. I like to use a die pick to kind of pierce into the adhesive behind it and use that to help place it. And then I use the finger from my other hand to just press that gem down where it's supposed to go. These ornaments have some areas that have little circle details to them. So those were the perfect places to put these gems in. And I really like the finishing touch it gives. It gives those ornaments just a little bit of extra sparkle and takes them to the next level. Another option here would be to use dots of the same glossy accents that I used for the first card. If you didn't have some gems, that would give you the look of some faux gems if you put some glossy accents in those openings. Another alternative. So once those are all done, I can put the ornament tops on. And this die set has the die to create the little chains or the little strings that these ornaments are hanging off. I die cut those out of that same gold pearl cardstock that I did for my ornament tops, so they match perfectly. I started with my center ornament, gluing that one down, then placed my ornament on top. For most of these ornaments, I'm using the full string. What I like to do is glue the whole piece down, and then I can lower or raise my ornament depending on where I want it to sit. And for the first 2, I didn't have to cut the ornament or the string down at all. For the last one, I found it was a little bit too long. So when I glued it down, I only pressed down the top part of it, knowing I was likely going to cut a little bit of it off. And then I just took a pair of scissors once I figured out how long I wanted it to be. Just took a pair of scissors and cut that the extra bottom piece off. And then once we have that ornament done or down, we have another completed card. Now, I didn't add sentiments to these cards. You certainly could. I chose not to. There wasn't a sentiment set in this collection. And I thought there was enough on the front of the cards that I didn't really need it. So you could always add a sentiment to the inside of the card. For the third one here, this is where I'm going to start including the essential dome shaker pieces. So for this one, I'm using the arch shaker domes. This coordinates with the Essential Arches die set. So what I did was I grabbed the Essential Arches die set and I picked ones that worked to cut out the opening for the front of my card, as well as a little bit larger one to cut out a piece to do my ink blending for the background for my focal point. It was a little bit easier to have a die cut to create my focal point out of than try to do it on the back of my mat that was going to go behind this piece and try to make sure that I had it in the correct area. By having a separate die cut, I could make sure that I had everything how I wanted and just lay it together. It made it a little bit easier for assembly. Once I had the arch cut out of the Fern cardstock for my card front, I just double checked to make sure that it was the right size. I find that with these die sets, if you can easily put that die right over top of the shaker dome and it goes all the way to the bottom and is a little bit too big, that one's too big. The one that is the right size is the one that kind of frames it really, really well, tugging it tightly, and it doesn't quite go to the bottom of the plastic of the shaker dome. I would try it with some scrap cardstock and just check and see exactly what I mean. For each one of I'm doing 3 different shaker dome shapes, and for each one of them there was a die set that was perfect, and I'm sure that Spellbinders thought of that ahead of time and specifically sized them for that. To do the ink blending on my background here, I'm using several different distressed ink colors. That pinky color is Saltwater Taffy, the lighter blue is Tumbled Glass, and then the darker blue is Chipped Sapphire. Now I wanted to add a little bit of snowflakes on there, so I'm using my splatter white. I have a distress sprayer that I sprayed on my glass surface there, spraying a little bit of water, adding a little bit of that splatter white. That water thins it out nicely to create a nice splatter. I use a brush, just the handle of a brush, and tap it on there in order to get that splatter all over the background. Let that completely dry, and then I can start assembling my piece. Now, I chose to only do one tree on this one. You could easily do a cluster of trees on there. I have the stem or the base cut out of Latte Cardstock, the back part of my tree cut out of Forest Cardstock, which is a nice dark green, and then the front piece cut out of Fern Cardstock. I didn't do any ink blending on these die cut pieces, but you certainly could. But the one thing that I did do, because I know I'm going to be using one of those shaker domes, is I bent the fronds or the branches of the tree forward to give it a little bit of extra dimension. And because that dome is going to protect it, I don't have to worry about that getting flattened at all. Once that is completely dry, I grabbed some shaker bits and poured them on the center there. I have some random shaker bits here that I just collect and I keep them in a bin for using with shaker cards. Once I have enough on that center, I'm going to take my shaker dome, use my liquid glue, put some liquid glue on the inner part of that shaker dome, press it on top, and then I'm going to let that completely dry before I continue. So in order to make sure that that shaker dome has good contact with my base there, I took that same acrylic block and I put that down just to give it a little bit of extra pressure. Another option would be to just stand there holding it, but I just didn't feel like doing that. And I figured while I had to wait for that to dry, I might as well wait, or I might as well put the outside or the background piece on there and let that dry at the same time as well. So I put glue around the inside part there that was going to have contact with that shaker dome and put that down. Then I put glue on the back side of my card. Now I was getting a little bit too ambitious here. I did it and it worked out totally fine. But for the next one, I do wait for things to dry a little bit longer and just make sure that it just makes it easier to work with. I glued this right to the front of the card, centering it, making sure I had enough room around there to see the card base. And then I took my acrylic blocks and I put one at the top and one at the bottom to make sure to hold it down. Left that for a few moments and then put them on the sides and just kind of swapped them back and forth just to make sure that there was pressure on both the sides as well as the top so that it would glue really well. So here is the card finished with that shaker dome, and you can see when I stand it up, it's not front heavy at all. It doesn't tip over. It stands up really, really nicely. I left my piece like that. You could easily add a sentiment to it, and I'll show you a couple sentiments that I had in a moment. I chose not to add them to the card because they were just a little bit on the big side and I didn't really like the way they looked. I think some small mini sentiments would be perfect, but like I said, the ones that I had were a little bit too big. Now I'm ready to go on to my fourth card. For this one, I'm using the stylish oval shaker domes. So I have a white piece of cardstock here cut for my background. I'm using those same colors for ink blending that background as I used on my last one. So the peachy color, the pinky color is Saltwater Taffy. The light blue is Tumbled Glass, then the dark blue is Chipped Sapphire, and then I go back with that Forest Moss and just do the bottom part, just so that I have a little bit of greenery on that bottom there. I do wish that I had my Saltwater Taffy bit a little bit higher. I wanted to see that just a little bit, but once I realized that I had it a little bit too low, it was a little bit too late. I'm going to repeat the same thing here with the splatter white, creating some snowflake splatter on my background here. Now, if I were to be creating a bunch of these at a time, I wouldn't be so wasteful with that splatter white. I could use it up. Here, I ended up having to wipe up the excess. A little goes a long way though, so even that tiny little pot of splatter white is going to last a long time. I have some Latte Cardstock here that I have a stylish oval cut out of the center for that shaker dome. And I embossed it with that wood embossing folder. Now, the one mistake I did do, and you'll see it in a little bit, is I forgot to cut that latte piece down to the size that I wanted it to be on the front of the card. So that is 4¼ by 5½ inches. And I will share with you how I fix it later once I assembled it. For the little antler on the deer, I die cut it out of a piece of holographic gold cardstock. This was solid hot foiled with a previous project, and it was a piece that I knew I wasn't going to use for a card front. So I just use it to die cut little pieces out of. It gives that deer just a little bit of extra sparkle to it with that antler there. You could use just plain cardstock as well, but I really love the look of this. On camera, I glued that antler right on top of the deer's head. Off camera, I decided I didn't like it that way and glued it behind so that it wasn't quite so prominent, a little bit more subtle, and I like that a lot better. Once that had dried, I'm ready to assemble and add the greenery piece to the bottom. This greenery piece is meant to be on the mantle die cut, and it's meant to be kind of like a greenery wreath. I thought it looked neat as some grass or greenery that the deer were standing in. I did raise it from the bottom of my stylish oval die cut because I wanted to make sure to have space for that shaker dome without that die cut getting in the way. I didn't want the dimension of that die cut there and have a possible opening that my shaker bits were going to come out of. With my image here assembled and ready to go, I can glue down that shaker dome. So I just put that liquid glue all the way around towards the inside part of that shaker dome, put it on my image piece here, and once again, put that acrylic block on there to hold it in place. And this time I waited a lot longer for it to dry so that it was really stuck in place before moving on to my next step. Then I took my brown piece here that was embossed with that wood embossing folder, put the glue around the inside, glued it to that shaker dome, and waited for that to dry. And this is where I realized that I had forgotten to cut down my brown piece smaller so that I could see some of the white from the base of my card. Now I kept gluing or kept it onto my card base because at that point I wasn't sure how I was going to fix it. Those sentiments were sentiments that you could use on these cards. I chose not to, again, because they were a little bit too big. These were joyful Christmas sentiments. They are glimmer sentiments. You could also, like I said before, use a small sub-sentiment, and I didn't have any that were already pre-foiled. Didn't really want to grab my glimmer out and do that, and I didn't have any that were Christmas themed either. So in order to try fix my background, I chose to grab a piece of matte gold cardstock scrap and use 2 of the stylish oval die cuts to create a frame to go around my shaker dome. Now I really like the way this looks and I love how this frames the dome. However, it didn't solve the issue that I had with not having a frame around the outside of the card. And I really wanted the finished image to have a frame around it. And at this point, I thought all was lost and I had to just make peace with it. I like the look of it, but I don't necessarily love it. So I stewed over it all night and I came up with a solution, but you'll see that in just a moment. For my last thing, I decided that I wanted to use the fresh picked shaker domes, and I'm going to use 2 of them and I'm going to create an ornament. So this was me getting ready for the next day. I was going to do this the next day, and overnight I stewed about this card and decided that I was just going to chance it and try to cut it in my trimmer. Now that Spellbinders guillotine trimmer, the metal or the wood plastic piece, the protective piece, it has a lot of wiggle room and give to it. And one of the reasons I didn't think I was going to be able to fix it was because I didn't think that shaker dome would fit under there to hold that cardstock in place to be able to trim it nicely. But at this point, I was like, if all else fails, I'm just going to have to recreate it. But I really wanted that frame on there. So I was able to trim it down. And that was not only the embossed cardstock, but the card base as well. It trimmed it down really nicely. Tried to glue it to the front of the card, and I thought with that gold frame around that oval, I thought it would look really nice to have a gold mat around my image piece as well. So that gold mat is cut to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8, and then my embossed and my image piece here is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And I love how this looked. I think it looked way better than the previous version. But I wanted to share fixing that with you so that if you make the same mistake that I do, you know exactly how to fix it. The other option would have been to use a straight ruler with an X-Acto knife, and I don't do as well with those. So now that those are done and fixed, I'm ready to start working on that ornament. I am going to cut 2 frames with this mirror gold cardstock. The smaller of the fresh picked die cuts is the size of the inner part of that shaker dome. The larger one is about the size of the outer part of that. I wanted to hide that plastic, and I wanted to have a way of framing in that ornament. Now I wanted to make sure my 2 pieces, because my ornament is going to have 2 sides to it, wanted to make sure that they matched. So I put those 2 cardstock pieces together after taping down the dies on one of them, ran them through my Spellbinders Platinum Stick machine, making sure to put some printed paper on the both sides to try to minimize the transfer of my really well used cutting plate, marring that gold cardstock. And I still get some impressions from it, but it's not nearly as bad as if I had avoided using it. After taking that out, I matched those dies up with the bottom die cut because it didn't cut all the way through that one, ran that one through again, and it worked perfect. So I have 2 frames that are going to work for the outside of my ornaments. I have 2 other pieces of white cardstock for the inside part of my ornaments for my image piece, and I'm going to do the ink blending exactly the same as I did for the last 2 cards. I'm doing that saltwater taffy towards the bottom, then I'm going to use some tumbled glass, then chipped sapphire, and then I'm going to go in and do that forest moss on the bottom. Now I'm doing all of my ink blending with my die cuts on my Altenew sticky mat. I like that it just holds them in place. I don't get any fingerprints on my cardstock. I don't have to worry about anything moving on me. And that sticky mat grips those die cuts really, really well. So I love using it for doing my ink blending. I'm using Spellbinders large ink blending brushes here. You can use them for heavy ink blending, and you can see that I get a little bit heavier around the outside. But because the brushes are so nice and soft, you can get some really light ink blending too if you want. I'm a little bit aggressive here with that forest moss on the bottom. I was to a point, it was one of those days where nothing seemed to be working or everything seemed to be taking longer. So I was getting to the point where I was just wanting to be done, which is not necessarily a great place to be. It's just how it was at the moment. But you don't see that at the final product because after I put that forest moss on there, I had a different idea, and you'll see that in a moment. So once again, I'm grabbing that splatter white, adding a tiny little bit of water to loosen it up and make it splatter really nice, tapping my brush against a brush handle. You could also do it against a pair of scissors, and splattering that on the background and letting it dry. While waiting for it to dry, I took some white glitter cardstock and just used the bottom part of the smaller of the fresh picked labels that I had used for doing my frames and created a snowy bottom here. Now I wanted my white glitter cardstock to be a little bit smaller than the piece that I was working with here. For the same reason as my last one, I wanted to make sure that I had room for the shaker dome frame to go over top of this and not have this impact the shaker bits or leave any opening in the side so that they would start falling out. While that glitter cardstock is dry, I can start assembling my houses. I have one house cut out of crimson cardstock, one of them cut out of white cardstock, and I always love having some gold in the windows. So one of these has some holographic gold. This is once again a solid hot foiled piece from another project that I knew I was not going to use from a card. The other one is one of the gold cardstocks from the Treasured Gold cardstock pack, because I didn't have enough of the holographic. I'm also taking a tiny little bit of the holographic and putting it behind the window in the door. And then I'm going to also take a tiny bit of the gold cardstock, put it behind the window of the door for that one, just so that they all coordinate well together. Now, because this gold is in the window, it just kind of, to me, makes it look like the lights are on in the house, and I just really like the look of that. These die sets, just like the ornament ones, have a solid or an outline piece as well as an inside piece. And that inside piece cuts out the windows and the details like that. The solid piece cuts the outside of the house. So they work perfectly together. Once I have those assembled, I can start assembling my trees. The trees have a base just like the Whimsical bottle brush trees. Those were cut out of Latte Cardstock, and then my trees themselves are die cut out of Fern Cardstock. Once again, I didn't do any ink blending for these ones or these die cuts because they're tiny and I didn't think it would be as noticeable, and I didn't think it would be missing anything if I didn't do any ink blending on them. You certainly could if you wanted. I have all of them glued together here, ready to start assembling my pieces. Now that die set has two different types of trees. I cut 3 of each. I'm going to use 2 of one and 1 of the other for each one of those frames. So I glued down one of the trees, then glued down my house, used the opposite or the same tree that I had already glued down to go on the opposite side of the house, and then the one that's the odd one out is going to go a little bit towards the front. So we're going to see a little bit of each one of those trees. You could take them and do the same trees for the same image. I just thought by varying them here, it just added a little bit of variety. Now I chose to do my ornament with the points here towards the top and then towards the bottom, because for an ornament, I thought that's how it worked best. And I chose to use the fresh picked shaker domes for these ones, but you could certainly use one of the other shapes as well. I think any one of the shapes would work well for this. I just love the idea of this as an ornament. And both of my images are fairly similar because I'm using the same die set. But I think any of the dies in this set would work for this. You could use those Whimsical bottle brush trees to do one of the sides and then this to do one of the other ones. You can get a little bit of variety with it. Now to add just a little bit of extra shine to my windows, I'm using some glossy accents, filling in those windows, and I'm going to let that completely dry before I move on with the next step. And I'm also going to use some stickles because I wanted to see some frosty snow or some sparkle on top of the rooftops. So I used the stickles for that, and I also dot the trees with it for a little bit of snowdrops or snowflakes. You could also use the stickles by just kind of putting like lines of stickles, if that makes sense, on those trees, just to look like snow sitting on the branches. I think that would look nice as well. Because I was waiting for the glossy accents to dry, I figured that was the perfect time to add the stickles. Might as well wait for all of it to dry at the same time. Now these are details that could be skipped if you didn't want to wait for those things to dry, but I think they really make those pieces kind of come alive. Now before I go and put my images inside the shaker domes, I'm going to add those gold frames. I put the glue on the inside of my frames, put those acrylic blocks towards the outside just to hold those in place, and then alternated them exactly the same as I did for the other shapes. Once everything was dry, I can pour the shaker bits in the center of my image piece, then glue down my shaker dome, and then let that completely dry. Now, when I'm putting these shaker bits in the center of my image piece here, I'm making sure that there's none of them that fall to the edge of it. I don't want any of those to interfere with gluing down these shaker domes. And I want to make sure that when I glue these down, I have a solid line of glue sealing everything in place. Once again, when that's glued down, I'm taking my acrylic block, just gluing that or holding that down. It just puts a little bit of extra pressure on there and makes sure that that has some really good contact. The other option would be to sit there and hold it down, which is also possible. I'm also making sure to place it so that the bottom part of that shaker dome is just below where the edge of my white glitter cardstock is. For the outside of my ornaments here, I wanted to give them a little bit of decoration too. So I have some die cuts from the Delivering Joy Sleigh die set. I have the poinsettias die cut as well as some holly and some pine branches. So I did one poinsettia that is the crimson cardstock. I'm going to put that on top of the ornament that has the white house with the red door inside. And then I have one die cut in white. That's one that is going to go on top of the other side with the red house. I'm also using some 1/8 inch gold ribbon to put some or to tie some bows. And I'm also going to use this same ribbon as my ornament hanger. I'm trying to get these ready while I'm waiting for glue to dry. Might as well utilize my time here. And in the center of that poinsettia, I also put one of those gold essential gems. You could also put some stickles there, but I thought the gems were a perfect center and just add a little bit of sparkle. Before putting my greenery and my poinsettia on, I'm using some 1/4 inch Suquang tape to hold down my bow. You can use the liquid glue to glue down ribbon, but it takes an awful long time for it to dry because the liquid glue and the ribbon don't really mix too well. With that ribbon down, and I don't have to worry about it moving on me, I can start gluing down my die cuts. So I'm going to glue down my pine needles first. I am tucking them in behind the ribbon. I want them to just be, I don't want them to totally cover the ribbon. So by tucking them behind, they're long enough so that you still see them, but they're not going to cover up that ribbon. So the pine needles here are die cut out of forest cardstock. My holly leaves are die cut out of fern cardstock. So I've got 2 different greens here. And I'm using the lighter colored die cuts over top of the darker colored die cuts just to show them off a little bit better. These ones here can easily be glued down with that liquid glue. It's not going to take too long for that to dry, but I do wait for the poinsettia to dry on top of that ribbon. Once again, for the same reason, the ribbon doesn't really like the liquid glue, so I want to make sure that it's good and dry before I glue the ornament backs together. I do also use a lot of glue on the back of the poinsettia just to make sure that there's a lot of glue there to have good contact with the ribbon. Now, even though that poinsettia is a little bit bigger, it covers some of the bow, but it doesn't cover it completely. You can still see the bow behind there, but I do like the addition of that greenery and the bow on the top. It just finishes that ornament off really nicely, in my opinion. So once everything was glued in place, I probably waited about 15-20 minutes before moving on to the next part. I wanted to make sure that that glue, that poinsettia in particular, was set in place before I started to move my pieces around and glued my backs together. To glue the backs together, I'm going to start with some of the Suquang tape. It's just a really nice, strong, double-sided tape, and I know that it's going to hold everything together while I'm waiting for that liquid glue to dry. I'm also going to take my scissors, and there's a little bit of the clear plastic from my shaker dome exposed outside of part of the window. I didn't have it quite centered enough, so I'm trimming that down. There's also a tiny little piece to trim off the second one. I did find it was easier to trim off with the face of the gold showing and just trimming off from the front than it was from the back. So for gluing the 2 pieces together, I'm using both the liquid glue as well as that Suquang tape. That Suquang tape is going to hold everything together, and then that liquid glue can dry in the process. But I do like to use that double-sided tape, especially to hold the ribbon for hanging. Because the ribbon doesn't like that liquid glue, like I said before, it's just going to hold it in place better than if I were to use just the liquid glue and then let that sit. I can push those together and it holds together instantly. And there we have our beautiful ornament. And I love the fact that both sides have a different image to them. Very similar, but a little bit different. And like I said before, you could use alternate die cuts and create different scenes if you want. There's several in this collection to use that would work really, really well with this. So then we also have our deer shaker dome as well as our tree shaker dome. Now these are cards that I would likely hand out to someone. I wouldn't necessarily put them in the mail. You would need a padded envelope or put them in a gift box or something. So it's something that I would hand out to someone, and it'd be fun to see people's face seeing them as well. And then by handing out, you also wouldn't have the extra postage that something with that dimension would have. Then we have our vintage ornament card. I love the look of the gold details underneath the color of that ornament. I think they're absolutely beautiful, and I love the variety of ornaments in there. And then our classic Christmas tree, and I love this one as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending your time with me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.